For 20 years, the company had been my second home. I'd walked into those glass doors when my hair was still brown, when my kids were still in grade school, when my marriage was new enough that we lived on takeout and late-night promises. I had stayed through mergers, cutbacks, endless Monday mornings, and late-night emergencies that pulled me from birthdays and anniversaries. My reward wasn't wealth or applause, it was pride. Pride in steady work, in knowing that if the lights were on and the machines were humming, it was because I had done my part. My boss, Richard Lane, never noticed. Or if he did, he thought acknowledging it would make me lazy. He was younger than me by a decade, the kind of man who looked at the world and saw nothing but his reflection staring back. His suits cost more than my monthly mortgage. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. He believed humiliation was management, cruelty was motivation, and fear was respect. The day it happened started like any other. Quarterly meeting, big presentation, Richard standing at the head of the conference table with a laser pointer and a glass of sparkling water. The room was full directors, managers, even some of the newer hires who looked at him like he was a god. I sat near the middle, my notes neatly stacked, ready to speak on operations like I always did. When my turn came, I rose, cleared my throat, and began to explain the numbers, supply chains tightening, margins narrowing, but solutions in sight. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. The kind of steady work that kept the company alive. Richard let me finish 3 sentences before he cut me off. "Thank you, David," he said loudly, his voice sharp as a knife. "But maybe next time, keep it short. We don't all need a bedtime story." Laughter rippled around the table. A few people shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but most joined in. Nobody wanted to be the next target. I froze. Heat crawled up my neck. My notes trembled in my hand. I was just trying to explain He waved me off. "Operations is boring, Miller. Nobody cares how the sausage is made. What we need are results, not excuses." He turned to the room. "Am I right?" More laughter. Nervous chuckles. Eyes avoiding mine. I sat down slowly, the paper in my hand suddenly heavy. My chest burned, but not from shame alone. From rage. Rage that 20 years of loyalty had been reduced to a punchline. Rage that the people I'd mentored, the juniors who had once asked me how to survive their first deadlines, were now laughing at my expense. The meeting rolled on. Richard strutted through the slides, talking about vision, growth, leadership, as if those things came from him and not from the army of people who worked behind the scenes. I didn't hear a word. My ears rang with his laughter. When it ended, I gathered my papers, stood, and walked out. Richard clapped me on the back as I passed. "Don't take it personal, Miller. Just keeping the room awake." I didn't answer. My pride was already ashes in my throat. That afternoon, I went back to my office, closed the door, and stared at the framed photograph of my family on the desk. My daughter's college tuition bill lay unopened in the corner. My son's text from last week blinked on my phone. "Proud of you, Dad. Don't work too hard." I thought about all the nights I'd stayed late, all the weekends I'd given up, all the times I'd believed loyalty was a shield against betrayal. And I realized, sitting in that chair, that loyalty to Richard Lane meant nothing. That was the day something inside me broke. Or maybe it was the day something woke up. By the time the sun dipped behind the glass towers of the city, I had already made my decision. I wouldn't quit, not yet. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of watching me slink away. But I also knew this. I would never again sit quietly while Richard Lane used me as a stepping stone for his ego. I walked out of that building with my head high, even if my pride bled inside me. He thought he had humiliated me. He thought it was just another day of him winning. But that day was the beginning of his end. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Emily breathing softly beside me, and the laughter from the conference room replayed in my head like an old record with a broken groove. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard Lane's smirk, heard his voice echo. "Operations is boring, Miller. Nobody cares how the sausage is made." By dawn, I had convinced myself that maybe it was just a bad day. Maybe tomorrow would be better. But humiliation doesn't dissolve with coffee. It lingers, it spreads, it infects everything it touches. When I walked into the office the next morning, people looked at me differently. Some smiled too politely, some avoided eye contact, and a few smirked like they were remembering the joke at my expense. I had been the dependable one for 2 decades, the man everyone trusted to hold the line. Overnight, I had become the company clown. I tried to bury myself in work. Reports still needed reviewing. Schedules still needed adjusting. Suppliers still needed calls. But no matter how many tasks I checked off, I couldn't shake the feeling that my chair had grown smaller. By lunchtime, the whispers started. I heard my name drift across the break room as I poured coffee. Did you hear? Lane really tore into Miller yesterday. About time someone did. Another voice chuckled. Guy acts like he runs the place. Maybe this will put him in his place. I stood there, holding the pot, my hand trembling. 20 years of building a reputation, and it had been undone in one afternoon. Not because of mistakes, but because humiliation was cheaper than gratitude. 2 weeks later, it got worse. Richard called me into his office, all glass and chrome, the city skyline winking behind him. He gestured for me to sit but didn't wait for me to get comfortable. David, he said, his voice smooth as oil. You've been with us a long time, longer than most marriages last these days, but times are changing. We need fresh ideas, younger energy, people who can sell vision, not just, and logistics. I felt the ground shift beneath me. Are you saying? I'm saying, he interrupted, it's time to think about your future. The company's future doesn't include operations as a separate division anymore. We're restructuring. He smiled like he was offering me a gift. We'll give you a generous severance. You can retire, spend more time with your family. Think of it as freedom. Freedom, that was his word for exile. I left his office with a folder full of paperwork and a knot in my chest so tight I could barely breathe. My badge didn't open the doors the next morning. My desk had already been cleared. I was gone, erased, replaced. At home, the silence was unbearable. My wife tried to comfort me, saying, we'd be fine, that I deserved rest after years of working too hard. But rest without dignity is just idleness. And the bills didn't rest. Tuition for my daughter's last semester, medical payments for my mother's care, mortgage that didn't care. I had given 2 decades to a company that tossed me like scrap. I sent resumes. I sat through interviews where 20-something managers smiled sympathetically and told me I was overqualified. That was polite code for too old, too expensive, too expendable. My savings bled. My confidence bled faster. And yet, even in the darkest days, something burned inside me. Every time I replayed Richard's smirk, every time I remembered the laughter in that conference room, the humiliation didn't just wound, it hardened. I began to study. Not out of desperation, but out of hunger. Nights that should have been for sleeping. I spent combing through industry reports, tracing Richard's deals, understanding the company's finances in ways I'd never bothered before. I discovered patterns, shell companies, questionable contracts. Money moved like a magician's trick. Lane wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless. He believed himself untouchable. One evening, I met with an old colleague who had been downsized the year before. Over beers in his garage, he told me what everyone knew, but no one said aloud. Lane's burning the place down from the inside. Investors love his swagger, but the numbers don't lie. He's covering cracks with paint. I drove home that night with fire in my veins. He had humiliated me in front of everyone, thinking I would crawl away and disappear. But I wasn't disappearing. I was waiting, watching. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. I picked up contract work where I could, consulting for small firms, advising on supply chains, teaching younger managers the tricks of keeping a business alive. The pay wasn't much, but it kept us afloat. More importantly, it kept me in the game, and slowly, opportunities began to align. An investor I'd met years ago reached out, curious about Lane's company. He's flashy, the man said, but I don't trust him. What do you know? I didn't answer right away. I just smiled and said, let me show you. That was the beginning. The humiliation that had broken me was transforming into fuel. I realized something vital. Revenge didn't mean rage. It meant precision. It meant patience. Lane had stripped me of my pride in public. I would strip him of his throne in the same way. By the time autumn came, the man who had laughed at me in front of the whole company had no idea what was waiting. His empire was weaker than he knew, and I had the knowledge to topple it. The world thought I was finished. Richard thought I was forgotten. But inside, I was sharper than I had ever been. And I swore, with every beat of my heart, the next time I walked through those glass doors, it wouldn't be as an employee. It would be as the man who owned everything he once lorded over me. Losing the job was like losing a limb. You still feel it there, still reach for it when the alarm rings at 6, but when you look down, nothing's left but emptiness. I'd been David Miller, operations manager, for so long that I didn't know who I was without the title, the desk, the steady rhythm of tasks that kept the company alive. Now I was just David Miller, 54, unemployed, overqualified and humiliated. At first I tried to keep a routine. I'd wake early, shave, dress in a shirt and slacks, and sit at the kitchen table with my laptop, firing off resumes into the abyss. I tracked them in a spreadsheet, neat rows of rejection waiting to happen. Some companies didn't reply. Others sent form letters thanking me for extensive experience, before reminding me they were seeking candidates better aligned with their future vision. The polite way of saying too old, too expensive, not worth the investment. My wife, Carol, did her best. She'd leave me little notes in the margins of the paper. "We'll get through this. Don't forget, you're more than your job." I loved her for it, but love doesn't pay tuition. Our daughter was finishing college, and the bills landed on our doorstep like enemy shells, each one louder than the last. Medical expenses for my mother piled up too. She'd always said she didn't want to be a burden, but illness doesn't take requests. By October, the savings I'd thought would carry us through retirement had thinned to a whisper. Carol went back to substitute teaching, even though her knees ached and the kids drained her energy. I started picking up odd consulting gigs, small manufacturers who needed advice on supply chains, family-run shops that couldn't afford a full-time manager. They paid in checks that barely covered gas, but at least I was working. Yet no matter what I did, I couldn't outrun the humiliation. Fairview was small, and Lane's company loomed large. When I walked into the grocery store, people who used to nod respectfully now gave me the kind of looks you reserve for a fallen giant. At church, folks whispered behind hymnals. One evening at the diner, I overheard two former colleagues at a booth. "Heard Miller's still looking," one said, stirring his coffee. "After Lane dressed him down like that, I'd be too embarrassed to show my face." They laughed, soft and cruel. I sat at the counter, back rigid, and forced myself to finish my meal. Rage would have been easy, but rage was a trap. Lane had built his empire on men like me losing control while he smiled for the cameras. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction again. Instead, I listened, because while humiliation had taken my pride, it had sharpened my ears. In the background noise of this town, I began to hear threads of truth. One old colleague confided over beers that Lane's vision wasn't as bright as it looked. Investors were restless. Quarterly numbers were doctored to shine for presentations, but underneath, costs bled. Another friend told me Lane was late paying vendors, hiding behind slick excuses and endless promises. The cracks were there, hairline fissures in the glass tower he stood upon. All I had to do was wait and push, but waiting is hard when the bills don't stop. Carol tried to shield me, but one night she sat me down at the kitchen table, her face pale. "David, the mortgage is 3 months behind. If we don't pay by December," her voice trailed. I put my hand over hers. "We won't lose the house. How can you promise that?" "Because," I said, my voice low, "Lane took 20 years of my life, and I won't let him take this too." Inside, though, doubt gnawed. The struggle wasn't just financial. It was personal. My identity had always been tied to loyalty, to steady work, to being the man people could count on. Now I was the man whispered about, the man laughed at, the man replaced. The echo of Richard Lane's voice followed me everywhere. Nobody cares how the sausage is made, but humiliation is fuel if you let it be. At night, when sleep refused to come, I spread documents across the dining table. Industry reports, SEC filings, news clippings. I built a picture of Lane's empire piece by piece. Shell companies connected like spider webs, charities with more outgoing transfers than incoming, real estate bought and sold at prices that didn't make sense. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Lane wasn't just arrogant, he was reckless, and recklessness leaves trails. Carol would wake in the night to find me scribbling notes. "What are you doing?" she'd whisper. "Studying." For what? For his downfall. By November, I had more than suspicion. I had evidence. Enough to know Lane was playing with fire, and one spark could bring his empire down. But sparks need air, and air means allies. That's when an old investor, Charles Whitman, called me. He'd always liked me, respected the way I kept operations running while Lane strutted on stage. David, he said, I'm hearing things. Numbers aren't adding up. Lane's promising growth but delivering smoke. Tell me what you know. I didn't answer immediately. Revenge whispered hot in my ear, telling me to dump everything. But patience spoke louder. I'll tell you, I said carefully, when I have enough to make sure the truth can't be buried. He chuckled. That's the David I remember. Call me when you're ready. The call ended, but my course was set. I'd been humiliated, stripped of dignity, cast aside. But in the ashes of my old life, a new resolve was forming. I would not crawl. I would not beg. I would not surrender. The struggle was still crushing me, bills, shame, whispers, rejection. But every day I spent surviving was another day closer to the moment I would rise. Lane thought I was finished. The world thought I was finished. But inside me, a fire raged that no humiliation could put out. And when the time came, I wouldn't just get even. I'd take everything. Humiliation can grind a man into dust, but sometimes it hardens him into steel. By the time winter rolled into Fairview, I was done licking wounds. Lane thought he had buried me under shame, but what he didn't know was that shame had become my shovel. Every insult, every whisper, every bill I couldn't pay, those were the blows that taught me how to dig, and I was digging straight under his empire. I began quietly. Information is the first bullet in any counterattack. Nights when Carol thought I was sleeping, I sat hunched over the dining table with a lamp burning low. Stacks of reports spread like battle maps. I traced contracts Lane had signed, names of shell companies he shuffled money through, invoices paid to consultants who had no offices, no staff, no existence outside of bank accounts. I learned the rhythm of his fraud the way I once learned the rhythm of supply lines. Every 2 months a surge, every quarter a reshuffle, every deal another sleight of hand. But evidence alone wasn't enough. Paper can burn, and men like Lane were experts at lighting fires. What I needed were allies, people with power, people with reason to see him fall. My first call was to Charles Whitman, the investor who'd reached out weeks before. We met at a steakhouse just off the interstate, a place where the booths were high and the waiters didn't eavesdrop. Charles was older than me, his silver hair combed sharp, his tie loosened like he'd just stepped out of a boardroom. He shook my hand with a grip that still meant something. I'm glad you came, David, he said. I've always known you were the spine of that company. Lane might have the mouth, but you had the backbone. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the documents I'd gathered: wire transfers, property deals, mismatched statements. His eyes narrowed as he scanned. He's cooking the books, I said. Not just massaging numbers. He's outright siphoning money. Charles's jaw tightened. I suspected. Now I see. He looked at me over the folder. What do you want? I leaned forward. I want him gone. And I want the company in hands that respect it. You have money. I have knowledge. Together, we can pull him down. He studied me a long moment, then nodded once. I'll back you. But remember, David, business is war, and war requires sacrifice. I knew sacrifice. I'd been living it. The next step was harder, convincing the employees who had once laughed at me to see the truth. They were Lane soldiers, but soldiers grow restless when the general keeps their pockets empty. I started small, meeting with old friends after work, buying them beers, letting them vent. They spoke of cut bonuses, slashed benefits, promises that never materialized. He says we're building something great, one muttered. But my paycheck's smaller every year. He says clients love him, another added. But I haven't seen a renewal in 6 months. I didn't push too hard. I just listened. People crave someone to hear them more than someone to preach. By the end of each conversation, I left them with a question. Do you really think Lane can carry this company another 5 years? Doubt is a seed, and once planted, it grows. Meanwhile, I kept my consulting gigs alive. They didn't pay much, but they gave me cover. They let me meet business owners, suppliers, clients. I asked careful questions, took careful notes. More than once I heard the same thing. Lane was unreliable. Late payments, empty promises, arrogance bleeding into incompetence. One supplier, an old man named Harris, leaned across his cluttered desk and said, Son, I've been in this business 40 years. Men like Lane don't collapse from outside attack. They collapse because the people holding them up finally walk away. That stuck with me. By March, the outline of my counterstrike was clear. I would gather the proof, rally the allies, and when the time was right, we'd strike where Lane was weakest. His reputation. Investors could forgive arrogance. They could even forgive mistakes. But fraud? Fraud was unforgivable. Claire helped me sharpen the blade. We met in her small office above the florist's shop. Files stacked so high the walls seemed built from paper. She wore her glasses low and her patience even lower. "You've got enough to rattle him," she said, flipping through my notes. "But rattling isn't the goal. The goal is collapse. You need to prove intent, not just incompetence." She tapped one page. "This transfer, see how it goes through a charity first? That's deliberate. He's laundering through nonprofits to look clean. Get me more like this and we've got him." So I dug deeper. I pulled public filings, cross-referenced tax records, chased paper trails that wound through half a dozen states. Every night I felt like I was peeling another layer off Lane's mask, and underneath it wasn't a visionary, it was a thief. All the while, Lane strutted across town like a king. He hosted luncheons, gave interviews, boasted of expansions, and sometimes, just to twist the knife, he made sure I saw him. At the diner, at the golf course, once even outside the bank, where he leaned in close and whispered, "How's retirement treating you, Miller? Shame doesn't pay well, does it?" I didn't answer. But inside, the fire blazed hotter. The turning point came in late spring. Charles called me to his office, a sleek corner suite downtown, windows stretching across the city. He closed the blinds, poured 2 glasses of scotch, and handed me a folder. "These are the other investors," he said. Quietly, "They're furious. They've seen enough of Lane's act. They want stability, someone who knows the bones of this company. They want you." My throat tightened. "Me? Don't play dumb, David. You kept that place running for 2 decades. You know every cog, every wheel. They don't trust Lane anymore. They'd rather back the man he humiliated." For the first time in months, I felt the ground tilt in my favor, but victory wasn't certain. Lane still held power, and men like him don't surrender quietly. We needed a moment, something public, undeniable, that would break his hold. That moment came sooner than I expected. Claire discovered that Lane was preparing a massive announcement, a merger with a flashy tech startup, meant to dazzle investors and bury his financial sins under promises of future gold. The gala was already scheduled. The press invited, the town buzzing. "He thinks this will save him," Claire said, slamming the press release onto her desk. "But it's our chance. If we expose him there, in front of everyone, he won't recover." I looked at the date circled in red. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to finish gathering evidence. 2 weeks to rally investors. 2 weeks to prepare for the night that would decide everything. I walked out of Claire's office and into the cool evening air, the city humming around me. For the first time since Lane had humiliated me in that conference room, I felt tall again. The struggle had nearly broken me, but now I wasn't broken. I was sharpened. Richard Lane had made one mistake too many. He thought humiliation was the end of my story. He thought he could laugh me out of existence. But in 2 weeks, the laughter would be mine. The night of the gala arrived dressed in silk and arrogance. The ballroom at the Fairview Grand shimmered with crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive perfume. Waiters floated through the crowd with silver trays, and the city's powerful men and women gathered like royalty awaiting a coronation. At the center of it all stood Richard Lane, my old boss, the man who had humiliated me before my peers. He wore a midnight blue suit that probably cost more than my yearly salary once had, his smile wide, his voice booming as he greeted investors and reporters alike. I entered quietly, unnoticed at first. I wasn't supposed to be here, at least not in Lane's mind. To him, I was still the ghost of a man he'd burned, a relic of loyalty tossed aside. But that night, I carried something far more dangerous than resentment. I carried truth. Claire had arranged everything. She moved through the room like she belonged, her glasses gleaming under the lights, her folder tucked close. Charles Whitman, the investor who had promised his backing, shook my hand firmly before slipping away to join the others in the corner. The stage was set. Lane tapped the microphone, and the room hushed. Cameras pointed his way, phones lifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice as slick as oil. "Tonight is not just another quarterly update. Tonight marks the dawn of a new era. Our merger with Innovatech will catapult us into the future. Together, we will redefine success. Applause thundered. Lane basked in it, stretching his arms like a preacher delivering salvation. And none of this would be possible without vision, without leadership, without the courage to take risks. That was my cue. I stepped forward, my footsteps steady, my heart pounding like drums of war. "Tell them the whole truth, Richard," I said, my voice slicing through the room. Heads turned. Whispers rose. Lane's smile faltered when he saw me. For a moment, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Then he recovered, chuckled, and leaned into the mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, don't be alarmed. This is David Miller, a former employee, a good man, but confused. Retirement has been unkind." I didn't flinch. I walked to the edge of the stage, pulled the black binder from my jacket, and tossed it onto the podium. Papers spilled across the polished wood copies of transfers, tax filings, shell company ledgers. Claire had organized them perfectly, each page a blade. "Confused?" I said. "No, Richard. You've confused arrogance for intelligence. You've confused theft for success." I turned to the crowd. These are his numbers, his real numbers. Money funneled through fake charities, contracts signed under ghost companies, millions stolen from the very investors he's been smiling at tonight. The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, reporters scrambling closer. Lane's face drained of color. He snatched up a page, waved it dismissively. "Fabrications, lies spread by a bitter old man who couldn't keep up." Charles Whitman stepped forward then, voice booming. "It's true. I've verified them myself. This man speaks the truth." Other investors joined him, murmurs swelling into outrage. Lane's composure cracked. "You think you can do this to me?" He spat, his voice no longer smooth but jagged. "This company is mine. You're nothing, Miller. You'll always be nothing." I looked him in the eye, steady, calm. "You're wrong. I was nothing when I let you define me. Tonight, I take that back." The projector behind him flickered to life. Tucker, one of the juniors who had once laughed at me, now manned the booth, having joined our cause. On the screen appeared slides Claire had prepared. Side by side, comparisons of Lane's doctored reports and the real numbers. Bank statements, shell companies with his signature. Evidence undeniable. The room descended into chaos. Reporters surged forward. Investors shouted. Employees whispered to each other, faces pale with the realization that their golden boss was nothing more than a thief in a tailored suit. Security moved in, not toward me, but toward Lane. Someone had already called Ortega the detective Claire trusted. Within minutes, officers entered, their presence heavy as truth itself. Lane's protests grew desperate, his voice breaking. "You'll regret this, Miller," he screamed as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. "You'll regret ever crossing me." I stepped back, letting the noise wash over me. For the first time in months, I wasn't the man humiliated. I was the man standing tall, steady, unbroken. As they dragged Lane out under the flash of cameras, I caught the eyes of the employees still seated. Some looked away in shame. Others nodded. Small gestures of apology, of respect returned too late. I didn't need their words. Their silence was enough. Claire touched my arm. "It's done," she whispered. "No," I said, watching Lane disappear through the ballroom doors. "It's just beginning, because tonight wasn't just about revenge. Tonight was about reclaiming my dignity, about proving that humiliation could be transformed into strength." Lane thought he had ended me in that conference room months ago. But he hadn't ended me, he had created the man who would end him. The morning after the gala, Fairview woke to headlines that felt like thunderclaps. Lane arrested for fraud. Merger collapses amid scandal. Whistleblower exposes corruption. My phone buzzed endlessly, reporters wanting quotes, old colleagues offering apologies, investors eager to meet. For years I had walked through those glass doors invisible, a cog in the machine. Now, for the first time, the world saw me not as the man humiliated, but as the man who had pulled back the curtain. Richard Lane spent the next weeks clawing at any escape he could find. His lawyers filed motions, tried to bury evidence, claimed conspiracy. But Claire had built our case like armor. Every document was backed by records, every transfer traced, every lie pinned under truth's weight. Charles and the other investors made sure none of it disappeared. Lane had burned too many bridges. When the tide turned, no one reached a hand to save him. Meanwhile, the company was in chaos. Clients panicked. Employees whispered. Contracts wavered. The board needed stability. Someone who knew the bones of the business. They called Charles first, of course, but Charles waved them off. "I don't want the chair," he said, looking straight at me. "I want to put it in hands that can steady it. Hands that already held it together for 20 years while Lane played king." At first I resisted. Humiliation leaves scars, and scars whisper doubts. But the more I thought of it, the more I realized this was never about revenge alone. It was about restoring what had been stolen from me: dignity, respect, and purpose. And now, I had the chance to lead not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength Lane had mocked. So I accepted. The first day I walked back through those glass doors, heads turned. Some employees looked ashamed, remembering their laughter that day in the conference room. Others looked hopeful, desperate for a leader who wouldn't discard them. I didn't gloat. I didn't sneer. I simply nodded and said, "Let's get to work." The office that had once been Lane's was stripped bare of his pretentious art and expensive whiskey. I hung a single frame on the wall, a photograph of the operations floor, the people who had always kept the company alive. I wanted everyone who entered to know where real power lived, not in suits and speeches, but in the work of ordinary hands. Rebuilding wasn't easy. Investors needed reassurance. Clients needed stability. Employees needed to believe again. But I had something Lane never did: trust. Slowly, contracts renewed. Slowly, the laughter in the hallways stopped being cruel and started being genuine again. Slowly, the company healed. At home, Carol smiled for the first time in months. Our daughter graduated without fear of unpaid tuition. My mother's care was secured. For the first time since that conference room humiliation, I slept without the weight of failure crushing my chest. One evening, months later, I stood at the top floor window and looked out over the city lights. I thought of Richard Lane, sitting in a cell, still cursing my name. I thought of the laughter that had once broken me. And I realized something profound. Humiliation is not the end of a man. It is the forge. Lane had humiliated me in front of everyone. But he didn't destroy me. He made me. He forced me to rise from ashes sharper than I had ever been. And in the end, the very company he used to mock me became the proof that dignity lasts longer than arrogance. When employees now call me Mr. Miller, I smile faintly and shake my head. "Just David," I tell them, "because titles don't define me anymore. Respect does. And that, more than the office, more than the ownership, more than the fall of Richard Lane, is the victory I will carry for the rest of my days."